The guide who walks the way never resorts to violence. The sage goes to the left side of the emperor, while the man of war goes to the right. Weapons are terrible things, and no sage will have anything to do with them unless there is no alternative. The sage wants peace and quiet. No victory is free of grief, and so to celebrate one is to glory in the death of innocent people. No one who revels in death like this can be true to the way, or is fit to rule in our world. At glad times, the place of honor is on the left. After disaster, it is on the right. So in the army, the officers stand to the left while the general stands to the right. So the whole thing is staged like a funeral. When a war kills many, we must mourn for them. And if you win the war, you must grieve it. This is finally one of the more affronting verses insofar as seeking peace over violence and quiet over destruction. Interesting how we're getting to a phase of the Tao in these recent verses that's much more do this, don't do this. And I know I spoke about this recently, but if you think of the first, say, quarter or third of the Tao, remember it's 81 verses, this is 31. That first quarter or third is really in the vein of talking about the way and how it comes into being and creation and what that force is and opposites and that sort of thing. And then this middle section of verses is really, really much more of this is going to help you live well and this is going to help you not live well. And this is smack dab in that vein of thinking. I don't know that there's a ton to unpack here. A lot of this, again, because this is very kind of poignant language, there's not as much to unpack, but there are a few things to mention. The sage wants peace and quiet. Again, remembering this is all about the experience. It's all about the yielding to the flow and being in the experience. And the way to do that is to be calm and be quiet, because one thing that commonly clouds your experience, which isn't obvious, and so you don't fight it as much as you probably should, is the chatter. All of your actual outward chatter, but also all of your inner chatter. So this is where peace and quiet goes a long way to helping you just have the experience, as opposed to constantly contemplating the experience, thinking about it in language which is different than the actual experience itself. And another interesting thing about this verse to me is the idea of killing, and that it is to be grieved, not celebrated. And this happens throughout nature. The Tao is often talking about humankind and how humankind does or does not reflect nature. But there's a lot of this going on in nature, not particularly war, but because of the way in which everything needs to eat to survive, there is certainly a lot of death and killing that happens. But you don't see a lion or some other animal of carnivorous intent. You don't see them celebrating these things. These are things that must be done in order to continue on, in order to just be in this world. And so in that way, it's just really transactional. It's a matter of a fact kind of thing. And so if you take a whole other realm of destruction, which is war, which is not feeding this basic biological necessity, then you really even amp it up even more and say this is really not something to celebrate. You shouldn't be touting your victories and how courageous and brave you were and the spectacle of it all and glorifying it in any way. It is a sad and unfortunate thing that just doesn't need to happen. And in that way, it should, no matter what the outcome, be grieved and be mourned that any of this even took place at all. And so the way to kind of work through this in a day-to-day, moment-by-moment way is always think of the peace and the quiet. And like the Tao says here, there is nothing of the guide or the sage who is looking to resort to violence. And the only way in which that happens is if there is absolutely no alternative. And there are probably very few moments in one's life where maybe many people, most people, would go through life without having this occurrence pop up at all. There are very few times in which there is no alternative. And so constantly be seeking the way of the Tao, yielding to the flow, and finding the path of least resistance. As it's probably pretty obvious to say, the Tao is often talking about following the flow like water does. And we know water finds the path of least resistance and stays low and close to the ground. And so that is completely at odds with the idea of marching and using force and participating in violence in order to get your way.